I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, a lot of people ask, why is the global economy stink so bad? Well, the primary reason is because the big countries, the so-called developed countries, blow huge wads of cash on pointless wars. Let's bring in political analyst Stacy Herbert. Stacy, tell us more about this.
Well, Max, it might be said that war is the last racket standing. It's the last Ponzi scheme actually holding the Western world together. Now, the first headline, however, bodes ill for this Ponzi scheme. Security firms by day, terrorists by night. This is Afghan President Hamid Karzai, and he's interviewed by ABC News. And now check it out.
The private contractors, you have called, and your office has called for them to be disbanded by the end of this year, in the next 4 months. That's something like 30,000 private contractors who are providing security. Are you standing by that declaration? You want them out by the end of this year?
Definitely, ma'am. The more we wait, the more we lose. Therefore, we have decided in the Afghan government to bring an end to the presence of these security companies who are running a parallel security structure to the Afghan government, who are not only causing corruption in this country, but who are looting and stealing from the Afghan people, who are causing a lot of harassment to our civilians, who we don't know whether they are security companies at daytime, and then some of them turn into terroristic groups at nighttime.
Well, they're mercenaries. You know, what do you expect from these folks? They're in it for the bucks. They don't care how they make their money. That's not ideological. It's not political. It's give me some more of that long green.
Karzai then goes on to plead with the American taxpayer. He says, please, you know, this is a massive waste of money to give all this money to these mercenaries.
Well, no, it's not. They're making a lot of money giving massive amounts of money on these mercenaries. If you want to make your money back, then buy stock in the companies that support the mercenaries, like the Halliburtons of the world. This is how you get your cash back. You got to invest in mercenary activity and all this overseas shenanigans. You got to be hedged.
Well, so as he points out, these guys are terrorists. The chief amongst them in America, of course, is Blackwater. And they're in the next headline. Blackwater founder moves to Abu Dhabi. So as Hamid Karzai pointed out, the American taxpayer is the one financing these guys. Eric Prince, it emerged in court documents in Virginia this week that he, from August 15th, actually moved to Abu Dhabi, which is a tax haven, of course. And now he's living there. And the reason why, according to the New York Times, a colleague of his says he needs a break from America.
No, the quote should say, he broke America.
That's a good way
now
to put
he's running away. You know, like Rumsfeld and Cheney, of course, they can't step foot in France anymore or in other countries in Europe because they'll be arrested and taken to The Hague for war crimes. Eric Prince, similarly, but he's not. For him, it's not a bug; it's a feature. You see, he's going to take his outlaw status and parlay that into some new fortune. Eric Prince Incorporated, of course, will not be stopped by laws.
Well, you mentioned Dick Cheney, and Halliburton, of course, already left last year or the year before to Dubai. But, you know, even the commander-in-chief looks like he may be abandoning America, taking a break from America. Does Barack Obama want to be reelected in 2012? So this is the Telegraph in the UK, and they're following up on a statement made by David Plouffe, who was part of the campaign, the Obama campaign. And he was quoted this week as saying that Obama is, quote, not concerned with his reelection. Now, Max, you have been mentioning this quite a few times, is that Obama has no intention of gaining the presidency again.
That's correct. In other words, the White House is now just a place to go to burnish your resume en route to the job you really want, working as a partner on Wall Street, or working in some of these new world organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. And this is where the global governance is going to be happening. Upstairs at the top floor of the global governance bureaucracy, the U.S., as such, will just be consigned to a region, and not a very important region at that.
Well, you talk about Barack Obama possibly going to Goldman Sachs or J.P. Morgan. Now, this takes me to the previous Prime Minister of the UK. Tony Blair sets up Mayfair Bank to act as dealmaker in investments for the super rich.
Tony War Crimes Blair? He's not allowed in France either, I don't think. Well, Well, you know William K. Black, who we interviewed on this show just recently, he wrote a book called The Best Way to Steal Money is to Own a Bank.
The best way to rob a bank is to own a bank.
I knew it was something like that. Anyway, so Tony Blair obviously is, I think, taken that message to heart, and he'll be joining the other kleptocrats, the global kleptocrats, the new KO, the new kleptocratic order.
The other thing about this is, as I, at the top of the show, pointed out, is that this war racket is the last Ponzi scheme standing. It's the only thing holding together anything in the UK or the US at this point. And when a Ponzi scheme is about to implode, and you saw this with Bernie Madoff, they get a little bit crazier, they get reckless, and they abandon ship, and they protect whatever wealth they have. So the next headline, concerns rise over Colonel Spicer's private army. Now, this is Colonel Tim Spicer, who is a very famous British mercenary who has run many British mercenary firms. And now he runs Aegis, and he's apparently applied this past week to put a holding company in Switzerland. So now Switzerland, who prides themselves on neutrality, are terrified that now this is a new trend, that these mercenaries are going to set up shop in their own state.
Well, the Swiss franc is moving up because I guess they want to be the Taliban stronghold equivalent in Europe.
You could say that, because if Hamid Karzai is saying that these guys are terrorists, these mercenary firms, and Switzerland becomes a safe haven for these terrorists, as Karzai points them out, if the U.S. collapses and there is a new, perhaps China, who's a very close ally of Afghanistan and Pakistan, if they decide that these are terrorist firms and Switzerland is harboring them, who knows what that might hold.
Yay, Switzerland. Well, that's the way to play. If you want to go long terrorism, buy the Swiss franc. If you want to go long mercenaries operating in a rogue state in countries around the world, buy Halliburton. I wouldn't be surprised. You know, the new holding company for Blackwater, I think it's called ZXE. I mean, they should go public. You know, they could probably raise a quick billion on the New York Stock Exchange. People want to get long terror. People want to own shares in pogroms.
And Max, a previous company that Tim Spicer ran was fined for basically offering mercenaries in Papua New Guinea. And the UN alleges he also tried to, he was stoking conflict in Sierra Leone. So let's look on this same story over in the U.S. Blackwater fined $42 million for hundreds of violations. So here we have these rogue terrorists, as they're now called by Karzai. These guys are basically committing hundreds of violations, and the State Department just fines them $42 million.
$42 million. I know drug dealers uptown got more than that in their sock. $42 million. That's a fine? That's a deterrent to crime?
Well, Max, is this likely to stop anytime soon? Well, let's look at this next headline. You would think, as you point out, the global economy is in a Great Depression. And you'd think by this point, American taxpayers would be tired of being so broke, right? No. Corporate media poll claims majority of Americans support Iran attack. Yes, these war racketeers are trying to now attack Iran. And 57% of Americans in this Rasmussen poll say Iran is an enemy. 51% say if Israel attacks Iran, then the U.S. should support it.
Well, they should, with full disclosure, mention that when they took that poll, they were holding out a Prozac or a cookie, saying, should we attack Iran, average American person, for a cookie or a Prozac? Give us the right answer.
Well, where does one turn if you're Iran and you want to protect yourself from war? Because where's the safe haven? Iran gold imports hit 22 tons in 4 months. Yes, Iran imported over 22 tons of gold ingots worth over $855 million in the first 4 months of their current calendar year. This amount represents an 85,000% increase in terms of volume and an 81,000% rise in terms of value in comparison to the previous year.
They're no fools. They're buying up gold like nobody's business. Of course they want to own lots of gold. So does China, so does Russia, because they understand that the dollar is the currency of the devil. It's the devil's currency, the U.S. dollar. It supports the devil and his minions over there in Washington and Wall Street. Sell short the dollar. Go long gold.
Well, of course, gold is the total anti-Ponzi scheme. And as we're talking about, this is the last Ponzi scheme standing is falling apart. This war racket is falling apart. So it makes sense for Iran, who sees the writing on the wall, to buy gold, which is the anti-Ponzi scheme currency.
Well, they listen to this show also. People watch this show all over the world, except some of the people who are blinkered, who live under the U.S. dollar devil currency hegemony, which is rapidly becoming garballonioni, baloneyoni. It's never going to survive. People who own gold know this. That's why they're buying gold.
Well, so they're investing in real wealth. Let's look at the American taxpayer who is financing all of this last Ponzi scheme standing. It's not a flight to safety. It's a cash out. So this is the reformed broker Joshua Brown, who we've had on our show, and he's talking about a New York Times piece where they point out that investors have withdrawn $33.12 billion from the stock market in the first 7 months of this year. And now the New York Times posits that there's a flight from risk, but Joshua Brown reckons that it's probably that they're delirious with hunger.
Yeah, they're selling the house. They're chopping down pieces of the house to burn as firewood. They're liquidating because they need that money for food. At one point, Stacy Herbert, you're a big shot political analyst on the global scene. Riddle me this. At what point should a country like China just commit financial euthanasia and just pull the plug on America and put it out of its misery? Because watching it writhe like this in pain, liquidating itself to buy cookies and Prozac is painful. Just sell those treasury bonds and put this dog down.
Well, Max, all our previous headlines point to this exact scenario happening, I would say.
Well, it's inevitable, and thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report, Stacy Herbert.
Thank you, Max.
Plenty more war talk coming your way on the Keiser Report. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to Washington, D.C. to talk to my guest, Paul McClary, Senior Editor of Defense Technology International Magazine. Paul McClary, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thanks so much.
Paul McClary, you recently wrote a blog post entitled Arctic Arms Race. While the world is focused on the conflicts in the Middle East, tell us about the race to secure the Arctic. Who are the players? What are their motives?
Well, the Arctic, due to global warming and the retreat of the ice pack, all the Arctic 8 nations, all the nations with territory in the Arctic, have made some noises over the past few years about increasing the defense posture in the Arctic regions. The United States, Canada, Russia, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, Norway, and Finland have all, in the past 2 or 3 years, actually written in their latest defense papers about the need to secure their Arctic territories.
All right, so we're talking about the Arctic 8, the A8. This is a new group, not to be confused with the G20, the G7, the G2, or any of the other big groups. This is the Arctic 8. Now, what sort of arms are we talking about? What hardware is being developed and how much is being spent?
Well, right now it's more talk than actual dollars being spent. The United States has always had a pretty robust military presence in Alaska with our military there. Russia's also had a pretty robust presence. Canada, surprisingly, not so much. The Canadians seem to be more worried than most other countries. I think just because they realize that they don't really have the assets up there to protect the sea lanes of the Northwest Passage and to protect possible, mineral extraction sites. The Harper government in Ottawa has promised funding for more icebreakers, and they want to build a search and rescue base up in the north. They want more of a permanent military footprint. But a lot of Canadian academics and people who watch Canadian military aren't so sure that the funding is actually going to come through.
Right. Well, Canada is taking a lot of grief right now, of course, for exploitation in the Alberta region, for the Alberta tar sands in terms of energy procurement.
Right.
So who is winning, would you say? Russia famously planted their flag at the bottom of the sea in the Arctic. Who else is closing in?
Well, the Chinese actually have the world's largest non-nuclear icebreaker at the moment. They're not part of the Arctic 8. They don't have any territory there. But they've launched 3 or 4 missions to the Arctic over the past several years, just for scientific exploration. But they're also building several more new icebreakers, so they can start exploring the region a little more. And no one's saying that they're going to claim any territory. But considering that the United States has 3 icebreakers, 2 of which are inoperable at the moment and in port and won't be able to sail until 2013, and the Canadian icebreaker fleet is old and in dire need of replacement, I think a lot of people are looking at the Chinese with a little bit of worry. I mean, the Russians have, I think, 18 icebreakers, some nuclear. The Russians are far and away the best situated to exploit the northern region.
Now, I guess we have to touch on the fact that there's a bit of irony here. There's a huge global warming and climate change denier industry in America, financed primarily by the right-wing media like the Fox News, and even the New York Times has done a very poor job in reporting on the climate change and global warming denying industry. The same group that we saw during the denial of cigarette smoking as being a health hazard have been essentially hired to come in and say, oh, no, there's no such thing as global warming and climate change. And yet, clearly, with the Arctic melting as rapidly as it is, this is opening up the sea lanes and the area for exploration by these and exploitation by these oil companies. Do you find it a bit ironic that apparently the same people who say there is no such thing as climate change and global warming are procuring arms to fight the race in the Arctic because, in fact, there is quite a rampant global warming and climate change?
Yeah, I mean, especially the Northwest Passage and the Barents Sea, the year-to-year ice has decreased significantly. I've read studies, Laval University in Canada had a study earlier this year that surveyed 125 global shipping companies, and only 11 of those companies said that they had any interest in really trying to use the Arctic region for global shipping lanes, just because the insurance is so high. It's very expensive to try to strengthen the hulls of ships. So as far as shipping goes, we're still a ways off. A lot more ice is going to have to melt before that happens. As far as oil exploration, there's an estimated 90 billion barrels of oil in the Arctic. People assume, no one really knows for sure. And that's going to be hard as well to try to start to extract, just because there's no real search and rescue capability in the Arctic. Russia, Canada, the United States, none of the Arctic 8 countries have any real ability to save anyone if something goes wrong up there, or if something like the Gulf oil spill happened. There's really no capability of going up there and plugging a hole or doing anything like that. So I think a lot of nations are treading pretty carefully. I think a lot of businesses treading pretty carefully, and it's going to be a while, I think, before we see real attempt at exploration or shipping lanes in the far north.
Well, you know, the Obama administration's making a specialty out of pointless suicide missions, and whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Arctic, they don't seem to discriminate. They want to throw money and lives at anything as long as they can twist a nickel and pad their personal bank accounts. But, of course, the oil that they're going to exploit is going to be burned, and it's going to exacerbate the ecological devastation, which, according to the mindset of these ecological eco-terrorists, the real eco-terrorists, of course, to them, this is a good thing, right?
Well, I mean, there's a lot more problems as well, as even with the existing oil pipelines in the far north. The Canadians are very worried that since permafrost is melting, some of these oil pipelines that are built on the permafrost might begin to collapse or leak just because the ground is softening up, or ones that are underground, you know, with the melting water, it's going to get into the pipes and corrupt the pipe. So there are a lot of worries, even with the existing infrastructure up there, that the warming is really going to have an adverse effect on it.
All right, so let's contrast what's going on there with what we've seen in the Gulf of Mexico. Obviously, British Petroleum, quite irresponsibly, drilled in a place that they had no sound backup policies in place to handle any contingencies. Of course, you could claim that this was unconscionable and they should all be thrown in jail, but of course, since they own the Obama administration, we won't see any of that. But what's the big difference between drilling in the Gulf, let's say, drilling in the Arctic? You mentioned some infrastructure problems. Is as the area thaws, and I guess this has an effect on the actual crust of the Earth, and it changes the actual geological structure. Is this part of the challenge in that area?
I think the major challenge is that while the ice is melting, especially the year-to-year ice, there's still a lot of ice up there in the water, and it comes and goes as on a yearly basis, and the ice flows are still pretty vicious. So if you try to do offshore drilling, I don't know if the technology really exists to build big oil derricks far offshore in these ice fields. I think there have to be a lot less ice before you're really able to do that and begin to extract the oil. I mean, a lot of these places in the Arctic aren't even, the ocean floor isn't really mapped very well because we've never been able to do it because of the ice pack. Now that the ice pack is melting, nations are beginning to go up there and try to map the ocean floor. And this kind of comes back to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as well, which the United States is not a signatory to it. It states that every nation essentially owns the floor bed about 250 miles offshore. If they can prove that the continental shelf goes further out than the 250 miles, they can claim another 350 miles. So the Russians are busily trying to map the ocean floor to claim the extra 350 miles. And the United States and Canada are just getting started. There's a lot of joint exploration going on. The United States and Canada have a few actually border disputes in the far north over the continental shelf. All
right, so the U.S. could conceivably go to war with Canada. Well, that would be yet another good idea. Let's move on to Afghanistan. President Karzai called the U.S. private military contractors, quote, terrorists by night. Your thoughts? Will Karzai really send these guys packing by the end of the year?
I don't think so. I think there will be some agreement reached. For all the black waters and all the small companies that do hurt civilians and flaunt the law, I think there are a lot of people as well that protect the State Department, protect the provincial reconstruction teams that are pretty essential to the security situation in Afghanistan. We need better regulation of these people. Some of them need to go out of business, but part of the issue as well is that it's been rumored that Karzai's brother, the governor of Kandahar, Walid Karzai, he's running a lot of these security firms down in Kandahar. So I don't know what effect that has on him or what, the talk is between the Karzai family. But it's a very volatile situation. And contractors, they do need to be reined in, but I would be surprised if this really went through the way Karzai is kind of making noise that he wants it to go through.
Yeah, I was struck by this interesting development. One of the major news outlets in the U.S. had great live coverage of U.S. troops leaving Iraq, and then the next day they reported on the new casualties of U.S. servicemen in Iraq. So this is a strange kind of withdrawal. I remember, I think when the helicopters left Saigon, I think that was it. I think that was the end. They don't seem to be able to let go of the kind of war profiteering and easy money that comes with occupation. All right, let's talk about Iran. There's lots of noise about attacking it. What are your sources in the defense industry think and the think tanks there in D.C.? Is there going to be an attack? I see my in-trade contract attack in Iran by the end of the year is kind of hovering at the 10% probability range. Is that a buy or a sell?
Well, I would call it a sell. I don't see the United States trying to open up a third front in the Middle East. And as far as the noise that Israel's been making, I think they're trying to bluster. They're trying to force the United States into kind of ramping up the sanctions. I mean, I think what they're doing is forcing the United States and the UN to take the issue more seriously, even though they are already taking it pretty seriously, to impose more strict sanctions. Israel, in order to attack Iran, would have to most likely fly over Iraq. And the United States still owns the airspace over Iraq, so that would be a huge complication in itself. Either would have to ask our permission and have it granted, or do it without our permission, and there could be some pretty adverse consequences with the United States there as well.
How come Israel's popularity has crashed so much in the last couple of years? I mean, they don't seem to be doing anything different than they've always done. But was it that book that Jimmy Carter came out with about comparing the wall there to the apartheid regime in South Africa? There seemed to be a turning point in public perception. What are your thoughts?
I think the Netanyahu regime has been making much more noise and taking much more aggressive posture in its foreign relations. I also think that the flotilla mess, Israel didn't really do itself any favors there. It was a very smart PR move by the folks on the flotilla, and they kind of put Israel in a really tough position and forced their hand, and Israel overreacted a bit.
Well, I think most Americans think that Israel is writing checks that they expect America to cash, and with unemployment the way it is and with the economy crashing, you don't want a rogue state out there on a spending spree on military adventures. We already got enough of that. All right. Well, thanks for being on the show so much, Paul McClary. And we're going to keep track of this waging war in the Arctic. Hopefully you'll be back on again soon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'd love to come back.
All righty, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Paul McClary. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.